Cast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the key findings of the Digital News Report 2019 by the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism and hosted by Reuters News Agency. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You have joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will also have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded and you'll receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view the recording. And now I'd like to introduce our host for today, John Pullman, Global Editor of Video and Pictures at Reuters. John?
Thank you, Tracy. Hello, everybody. It's John Pullman here. I'm sitting in Reuters headquarters in London, where it is 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And sitting alongside me, I have Nick Newman, who's the lead author of the Digital News Report and a senior research associate at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. Now, I'm glad you're all here. Like me, you probably realize that this is a date in your calendar. The publication of the Digital News Report is a date that journalists and the news leaders around the world look forward to. This is one of the most comprehensive, helpful, insightful pieces of research on our industry, and it's widely quoted and used as a sort of research tool throughout the year. So I'm really delighted that Nick's here to run us through the findings. We'll do that for about half an hour, and then we'll take questions from you. So Tracy's told you how to submit questions. We'll remind you of how to do that later in the session. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Nick, who will talk us through the key findings of this year's report.
Thanks very much, John. Hello, everybody. I'm going to kick off with just a little bit of background around the report and how we create it. As you may know, this is the biggest ongoing survey of news in the world. So we polled 75,000 respondents this year in 38 markets and 6 continents. We're delighted to have added South Africa this year, sort of part of our commitment to increase understanding of markets in the global south. And we'll try and do more of that in coming years. I should also say, as I do every year, this is an online poll. So it is representative of those who are online, but not necessarily of national populations. And that's particularly relevant in countries that have lower internet penetration. You can see on the screen some of those countries marked. The other thing is it will tend to, because it's online poll, it'll tend to underrepresent traditional news behavior such as television, print, and radio when we talk about cross-platform behavior. Most of what we're looking at is digital, so that doesn't really affect it. But when we do those comparisons, it's just worth bearing that in mind. The polling was done on our behalf by YouGov, Market Research Agency. We used samples in each country of around 2,000 people with various quotas to make sure that they were as representative as possible. And this year we also added to the survey in-depth interviews in the UK and US and UK with younger news consumers, tracking their digital habits. And we're going to incorporate a few quotes from them in this presentation. Finally, in the intro, we're very grateful to a wide range of sponsors, including the Thomson Reuters Foundation, who support our independent academic work and are core sponsors of the Reuters Institute, to 14 other organizations that support this particular report. You can see them at the bottom there. They range from Google, the BBC, a number of regulators, media regulators, foundations, and industry organizations. So enough background onto some of the content of this year's report. So firstly, we find that more people are paying for news, but growth is still really focused just on a few big countries and a few big brands. And we're suggesting that the limits of existing subscription strategies may become clear in the next year or so. Secondly, we find that concerns about misinformation are actually changing behavior. So more people say they're relying on reputable sources of news and avoiding outlets with a poor reputation for accuracy. Despite this, though, we find that trust in the news continues to fall. People are also complaining increasingly about news overload, negativity of the mainstream media. Fourthly, in the social space, people say they are now, in most countries, spending less time with Facebook, more time with Instagram, YouTube, and WhatsApp, as the shift to private messaging picks up pace. And then finally, we're pretty bullish about the future of audio and podcasting, which continues to grow in many countries and is especially striking a chord with young people. So the search for sustainable business models goes on. With disappointing revenues from digital advertising, more publishers are pinning their hopes on reader payment of various kinds. So that might be subscription, membership, or donations. And our data this year shows some growth, but it is really focused on a small number of countries. So the United States obviously has increased from 9% in 2016 to 16% in 2019. It's been stable this year, but it has grown 7 percentage points since 2016. The UK has shown a small increase this year to 9%, and then leading the pack still Nordic countries, where sort of around on average a quarter say they're paying for some kind of online news in the last year. And in Norway in particular, that has continued to grow this year, up 4 percentage points, 34%. However, overall, the average in the sort of bigger countries that we've been looking at remains pretty flat in terms of the overall percentage, even though individual publishers have been growing, with that sort of big exception in the United States related to the election of Trump and people investing essentially in liberal publications like the New York Times and the Washington Post and subscribing. They haven't churned out of that subscription, they're continuing to do so. More than that, though, we're seeing that not only the growth is confined to a few countries, it's also confined to a few big publishers, suggesting that winner takes all or winner takes most dynamics may be at play. So these are actually figures for digital-only subscription in the United States. And you can see how some publishers have really made huge strides. The New York Times, 3.3 million digital subscribers, for example. But a recent Business Insider poll showed that half of all news subscriptions go to these three publishers. And if you look at our data in general, we find that people who subscribe to online news tend to be better educated, they tend to be richer, and crucially, they tend to be more interested in news. In other words, everyone is kind of chasing this same relatively small pool of people in each country, and more people are obviously doing that right now, which is part of the difficulty and dynamic. More evidence of that comes when we look at the number of subscriptions or contributions that any individual takes out. And just to repeat, this shows people who are using any kind of ongoing payment. So either you're paying for yourself or somebody else pays. And what we find here is that the vast majority are only prepared to pay for one subscription. And this is true for richer people, it's true for more educated people, and it's true in almost every country we look at. Another complication is that news is now only one of many businesses looking for your money in an ongoing way, looking for a subscription. So just in the media space, you have entertainment services like Netflix, music services like Spotify. Increasingly, you have sports, whether you're paying for a particular event or an ongoing subscription, online dating, storage. There's just a whole range of digital media companies asking for subscription. So it seems that the high-priced single-title subscription may be hard to grow for all but the very strongest brands, which is one reason why some publishers, at least, are looking at a range of other options to supplement this, including differential pricing, cheaper pricing for international users, for example, maybe bundling of different publications together or different offers together, student offers, and other ways to try and break out of that relatively small group of people to a wider group of people, which I think is in many ways going to be the story of the next few years. So just moving on to the issue of gateways, and this is related to payment, because part of the issue when trying to charge for content is that publishers, to some degree at least, have lost that connection, that direct connection with the audience that makes that possible. And we illustrate this every year with a chart which asks people what their their main starting point for news is, what their main gateway for news. And here you see that across all 38 countries, around a third or less than a third now, 29% say they prefer to go directly to a website or app. And that is down 3 percentage points on last year. And then you see others who actually prefer to start with a search engine like Google or a social network like Facebook. And then other people say that their starting point is maybe a mobile alert or a mobile aggregator like Apple News. Overall, we have side door access, so in other words, not going directly is about 71%. And if you put together the ones that use algorithms like search engines and social media and aggregators, around a half essentially are getting stories that are selected by a machine as opposed to a human journalistic editor. Now, one of the things we've tried to do, those are averages, and one of the really interesting things we've tried to do is to sort of split down how this works in different countries. And we find some really interesting differences between countries. So in countries like Finland, Norway, and Sweden, you actually have a much closer connection to those brands. So 64% say that their starting point is actually a brand or an app, the website of an app, rather than search engines, social media, or some of these side door exits. In other countries, Latin America being a very strong trend here, you see that the majority prefer to access news through social media platforms and search and direct second and third, also in places like Malaysia. And you can see it's therefore much harder for those companies to have that direct connection because they're going through a third party in some ways. In countries like the US, Canada, Ireland, it's a bit more pick and mix. So some brands have this very strong connection, direct connection, some of the bigger brands. But in general, people are sometimes using search, sometimes using social, sometimes direct. And then finally, there's a fourth set of countries which are much more about aggregation through search engines or portals. So Korea has a couple of really big portals that combine search and aggregation, news aggregation. Japan, you have Yahoo News, for example. And in these countries, most people are going through those aggregators as their starting point. So it's going to be much, much harder to charge for content and to really build those long-term relationships in these markets. So it's interesting just to see which of those markets you're in. And then we thought, well, let's look at the connection between how loyal you are and whether people are taking out digital subscriptions in those markets. And you can see the broad connections. At the bottom, we have the proportion that prefer to go directly. And then along the side, you see the proportion that have a digital subscription. And there's a clear connection. The sort of stronger your direct connection, the easier it's going to be to charge for content. I think this is, I mean, most of the industry is really looking at how they build that habit, how they build that direct connection. Email is a clear tactic that I think publishers have got a lot better at recently. But it's interesting to see not only are emails used by older people, there's also quite a big difference in terms of countries where they are part of the culture. So the US, about a fifth of people get daily emails, daily news emails, get their news that way. Whereas in the UK, daily emails for news are not quite as strong. You'll also notice there's been almost no increase over time. And this is essentially people who are very interested in news again. So you're not really getting out of that group of people. I think mobile notifications are a bit more interesting in that regard, partly because they're growing. So in many countries from 3, 4, 5% to somewhere near 20%, but also because you're reaching different people with mobile notifications. You're reaching younger people, people who aren't necessarily interested in news all the time. So I think these are obviously two tactics that publishers can use. Another big trend that we highlighted last year is the move to private messaging and groups. And in many ways, this is now being pushed by Facebook as part of its new strategy. So Mark Zuckerberg's talked about not just communicating and connecting in the public square, not everything being open, but really developing all the networks, including Facebook, to be much more cognizant of the fact that people want to sometimes to broadcast to everyone and sometimes to have more private conversations. What does that look like? So at an overall level, this is the use of social networks for any purpose. So not just for news, this is anything. And this is averaged across around 12 of the countries we've been looking at since 2014. So this is kind of an average. And you can see broadly that Facebook and Twitter are both flat. So there's been very little growth. So people aren't necessarily coming off Facebook. They're still there in terms of weekly reach. But the big change is this sort of enormous increase you can see in the green line. That is WhatsApp. So going from around 15% to 45% who say they use it for any purpose on average. And then Instagram from less than 10% to 32% and accelerating in the last year or so. If we look at news specifically, it's also a fascinating chart. You can see, so this is purely, are you using these networks to find, discover, share, consume news? You can see how Facebook has become less important over time, particularly since 2016, and that's partly their own strategy, their own algorithm changes that have done that. And you can see again WhatsApp and Instagram on the rise. These are reach numbers, but we also this year asked for the first time about time spent. So are you spending less time or more time with different networks? And this is the net figure. This is just UK data, slightly different in different countries. What we've done is we've asked people whether they're spending more time and less time, and then we've just showing here the net figure. So, and broadly, we see that people spend less time on Facebook, they're spending less time on Snapchat, and considerably more time in the UK on Instagram, and a lot more time on WhatsApp and more time on YouTube as well. And you can see the difference there between all and under 35. So kind of in the UK, at least, you've seen under 35s almost swapping out Snapchat for Instagram. That's a pretty significant shift. And then the WhatsApp changes is something slightly separately. If you look globally, it's really interesting to see how differently and how heavily WhatsApp is used for news. This is a chart which shows for news in the global South compared with Western countries. So in the US, only 4% of people say that they're using WhatsApp for news, whereas in South Africa, Brazil, and India, where we polled at the same time in January, February this year, you've got about half of people who are saying they're using that for news. The other point is that people are using WhatsApp groups differently. So whereas in the West, we tend to be using them very small groups, family members, maybe work friends. In places like India and Brazil, the groups are much bigger, and in many cases, they're set up for news. And they're more likely to be groups with people they don't know. And that's one of the reasons why misinformation has been spreading much more through WhatsApp in some of those countries. They're more heavily used, and the groups are bigger as well. We looked this year a little bit at messaging group, Facebook groups as well, which Facebook itself is now pushing much harder. And we were surprised to find that 63% said they were part of a Facebook group of some kind. Most of those, by the way, are not news. They are groups maybe about community or about parenting or personal passion in sports. But a considerable number of people are members of groups Facebook groups where news is discussed. News groups users tend to be male, they tend to be educated, they tend to be more politically partisan, and people who use the news groups also tend to be distrustful of mainstream media. And again, this just shows the differences between countries like Turkey, Brazil, Malaysia, where around a quarter of people are in a Facebook groups to discuss specifically news and politics, whereas in the UK, as one example, only 8% are in a Facebook group for news and politics, and only 2% take part in a WhatsApp group around news and politics. So some really interesting differences there, which we'll keep an eye on going forward. In terms of misinformation, I think the nature of misinformation is changing. It's likely now to be spreading through WhatsApp or Facebook groups, as it is through open networks like Facebook. That's a change. And we look at the level of concern every year about whether people can tell the difference between what is real and fake on the internet when it comes to news. And this is the sort of country picture, and you can see again Brazil there at the top. Obviously, the Brazilian elections were influenced by misinformation. There was a lot of concern about it. Whereas at the other end, you have the Netherlands with only 31%, where it's been much less of a problem. Interestingly, in the UK, it's risen by 12 percentage points, and it's really hard to argue that in the UK we've seen more genuinely false news being spread. This is probably more to do with people's perception of Brexit, or the fact that the media has certainly been raising concern about this issue within the last year. It does, however, seem to be changing online behavior in a way that may benefit some publishers. Across countries, we find that around a quarter, 26%, say they've started to rely more on reputable news sources than a year ago. And that rises to 40% in the US. We actually left it to respondents to define for themselves what they mean by reputable. But in the interviews, we had the same themes coming out quite strongly. So this is Chloe, one of those we talked to in the UK as part of the project, talking about being more limited. So not trying so many different sources, but sort of coming down to ones that have been around for a long time, like the BBC, like The Guardian. We also found that people are relying less on news, on brands they consider to be less reputable or less accurate, so 24%. And again, the interviews back this up. So here's Maggie in the US saying that they're really less likely to click on a story if it comes from a source that they've never heard of before. So I think some of the campaigning and publicity around this issue and some of the digital literacy is clearly having an effect, but it's to be noted that much of the change behavior is with younger people rather than necessarily with older people who have a long track record of spreading false information. So brings us on to trust overall, essentially saying they trust news most of the time has fallen 2 percentage points across country to 42%. And if we look at some individual country examples of this, we see quite a big change over time. So just going back to 2015, not only is trust fallen in the last year, actually in some of these big countries, we've seen falls of sort of 10, 11% in that period of the last 5 years or so. Even in countries like Finland, where there haven't been any sort of seismic events that might have driven that. In the UK, you can kind of see some of the events that have led to that change in trust. So after the Brexit vote, the trust levels went from around 50% to 43%. And that's really people who feel very strongly about the issue and who are looking at a media that is carrying statements they don't like or is trying to provide a sort of range of opinions. And in that sense, they feel that the media company is not representing them sufficiently. So I think that's partly what that's about. We've also seen a really significant drop in trust in France in the last year, 35% to 24%. Again, very strongly linked to the Gilets jaunes protests. As you may know, the media was very much seen as not representing the Gilets jaunes, as being too close to the elites. In many cases, they were attacked, physically attacked, had to go out filming with security guards. So the media is often sort of increasingly seen as part of the elites and not representing ordinary people. And I think that's something that the media needs to really think about going forward, how they can improve representativeness. You may have noticed in that slide that the US was pretty level, but if you look beneath that at what's happened since Trump's election, you see a really, really interesting story. So the average remains about 32%, but people who self-identify on the left as liberals essentially now trust the media more because they see the media as a check against Donald Trump, whereas people on the right have less and less faith in the media, much of which is on the liberal left. And this has obviously been inflamed to some degree by the rhetoric of Donald Trump, who repeatedly talks of the liberal media as fake news. And you can see the sort of level of polarization in the US. So when we ask about brand level trust scores, CNN is trusted by people who self-identify on the left. They give it a score of 7.4 out of 10, whereas people who self-identify on the right give it a score of 1.8, and it's almost the reverse for Fox News. So that's the biggest range of polarization and trust gaps that we see, but we see them in other countries as well. So this is something to keep an eye on. Moving on to trust is obviously one measure. We wanted to dig further this year into how people feel about the performance of news brands, other attitudes. Are they covering the right agenda? Does the media strike the right tone? Where are they perceived to be doing a good job and where could they do better? Overall, we find relatively high levels of satisfaction about how quick people are to responsiveness to news, the media, So 62% on average said the news media does a good job in keeping me up to date. But only about half, 51%, think that the media does a good job in explaining the news or helping people understand it. And it feels there's a real gap here in terms of expectations, and a real message that people are looking for meaningful content for understanding, not just to be bombarded with news. And then beyond that, we asked about some other attitudes. 39% feel the news media is too negative. In some countries like Greece, that's 59%. 28% say they feel worn out by the amount of news. That's related to the point earlier. And then about a third say that they actively avoid the news, often or sometimes. These are all people who consume the news, but on certain stories at certain times, they are avoiding the news. They're preferring to do something else. And that figure is up 6 percentage points since 2017. And when we ask people why, people say because the news is depressing, it's bringing their mood down, or that they feel completely powerless to change things themselves. The biggest increase in news avoidance, John, of all countries we look at comes in the UK, up 7 percentage points on 2 years ago. Any reason, any ideas why, John?
Can't imagine one.
Can't imagine, okay. I'll give you a clue. Here it is. Not difficult. So it's all to do with Brexit. So we asked people to tell us the reasons, and this is a word cloud of some of their answers. And when we asked them more specifically, 71% said that the news they were avoiding was about Brexit or about politics in general. So these concerns are to some extent about real life events, but it's also about the way in which the news media covers them. It's about the agenda, it's about the approach. And we see, here's some quotes actually. So here's somebody just talking about making a new resolution to stop watching political news because it has a negative effect on their mood. Here's somebody who essentially sees it more as biased. There's no point in turning to the media because they won't reflect what my views are, which in this case is to get on with it as quickly as possible. These concerns, I think, are driving the emergence of new kinds of news organizations, often called slow news organizations. We have the launch this year in the UK of a new organization called Tortoise Media, which has a catchphrase, slow down, wise up. You also have The Correspondent, which is one of the pioneers in this area, now moving into English, Republic in Switzerland, Zetland in Denmark, and elsewhere you find attempts to build sometimes more constructive or solutions-based journalism. This is an example, BBC World Hacks, I think it's now called People Fix the World podcast. And then others are trying to do more explanatory journalism. So Vox, Aftenposten, Indian Express, these are all organizations that are trying to close that gap and increase more meaningful content. So again, something to think about there. Smartphone briefly, it's amazing how every year this kind of grows. We hear a lot about smartphone sales leveling off, but the amount of people that use them for news continues to grow. So 6% across countries say they use the smartphone for news on a weekly basis. But it's not just the numbers, it's also our dependence on these devices. So in the UK, the smartphone is now the most important device for accessing news first thing in the morning. So about a third of people say that the first place they get their news is from a smartphone, which is actually the number one device now. It sort of overtook television. Mm-hmm. And when we last asked this question in 2016, it was only 16%. So you can see the change in just 3 years. And again, if you look at younger people, it's 54%. So, you know, for them, smartphone is everything. They pick it up first thing, and they're more likely to get the news through a social media feed or maybe an alert coming to their phone. And I think this really helps to explain another trend that we see in our data, which is the rise of mobile aggregation. So you can see here the chart for Apple News in the UK and the US, where amongst iPhone users, more people now use Apple News than the Washington Post, as one example. So really, really significant usage. And these services are kind of built into the operating system now. So you just kind of swipe left when you buy the phone. Android phones have similar services, you know, Update or News Republic or Flipboard. And it's quite hard to ask about in a survey because people don't really know that it is Apple News, nor do they know necessarily which news brand has produced the story in many ways. But young people in particular really like that convenience, that sense that it's kind of consolidating everything, not giving them 4 versions of the story, just bringing it all together. So it's partly about convenience, and it's partly just because it's on the phone, and they're on the phone, and you just get a notification, and they don't know who it is or who's produced it necessarily, but this is a really significant trend. So finally, what about audio? So audio, I think, has become one of the hottest topics in media today, and I think we're seeing in our data continuing growth. So it's not sort of massively taking off, but every year, sort of a couple, 3 more % are discovering the value of on-demand audio and some of the amazing content that is now out there. Obviously, that's for any kind of podcast, and in terms of news podcasts specifically, it's about 15% on average, more or less in some countries, but critically, young people are driving this growth. In every country we look at, under 35s are consuming proportionally much more. I think Mark Thomson was talking at WAN EFRA conference saying that of the 10 million people who listen to the daily podcast a month, around half of them are under 30. And that is absolutely reflected in our data. As you know, across Europe and the world, media companies have launched daily news podcasts over the last year. Some of them successful, some of them not successful. And it'll be really interesting to see how that moves over the next few years. One of the really interesting things we looked at this year was why are people using podcasts? So what are the motivations? And this chart shows the different age groups. So a range of views. So a lot of it's about learning, entertainment. It's just filling empty time, which having on-demand audio with the speakers and the headphones and the smartphone together really facilitates. Younger people in particular, so the youngest group, 18 to 24, are more likely to be consuming entertainment kind of podcasts. They're just looking for a bit of fun, really, and to kill some downtime. But really interesting is the 25 to 34s, very different motivations, which we find in general when we look at young people, is this group is really interested in learning, in progression, and that's really striking a chord as much as the very oldest groups. And they're also, obviously, they want entertainment as well. So it's really about how you combine these things. And the best news podcasts are entertaining in their own right, but they're also dealing with really serious issues, but in a way that is incredibly engaging. So I think that's worth bearing in mind for anyone who's thinking about podcast devices. So again, this really just shows the power of what's really driving this is the smartphone, the better connectivity, and the better headphones. 55% of all consumption is through smartphones. It's UK data, only 8% through smart speakers. And here's just really summing up 3 reasons why young people who we talk to think podcasts are great. Number one, they are really easy to multitask, and this is the multitasking generation. We talk to people who were actually playing a video game and listening to a podcast at the same time, not something I could do. And it's just really easy. You just sort of turn it on and it washes over you. So it's not difficult. You don't have to make any decisions. You basically start and it goes. Secondly, this group really wants to self-schedule. They want to curate things for themselves. They don't want a scheduler to tell them what they need to listen to when, so it fits that. And finally, and this is really, really critical, I think, is the tone. It's less stuffy, it's not as traditional, and the range of ideas and thoughts is much wider. And that's another thing that is really appealing to younger people. So those 3 things, I think, are at the core of why podcasts are taking off. Smart speakers continue to grow, and we now, they're available in about 14 countries with Google and Amazon devices. But in the UK and US, which we've been tracking since 2017, you can see they're pretty much doubling year on year. UK from 7% to 14% this year. However, when you look at the news usage, it's relatively low. So on average, about a third of people, that's the dark blue line, say they're using them for news. And when we went into this in detail in November in a major report we did on this, we found that they weren't really engaging very much. They felt they had enough news bombarding them from smartphones and everything else. They didn't really need news on another device. So I think this is a really interesting slide for both the platforms to consider and also the publishers to consider. Somehow, we haven't quite got it right in terms of how we get news into these devices. They're mainly being used for for music, for turning on the radio, for setting alarms, for fairly simple command and control things. I'm not saying it won't happen, but at the moment we haven't really seen this taking off, and obviously we'll continue to look at that. So just finally, some sort of questions. So as some people at least come back to reputable news brands, can we capitalize on that? What do we have to do to get people to pay or to value the news more? Secondly, how should we think about some of these findings that people find the news too negative, they're worn out by the news, they find it depressing? Do we need to change the agenda? Do we need to think differently about the journalism that we produce? Thirdly, there's clearly going to be some winners and some losers in the shift to paid content. How can we think about bundling content or changing pricing so we can bring in a wider range of people into paid content? Fourthly, how are we going to deal with the fact that more of the conversation and discussion is moving to private areas where we can't intervene necessarily or be part of that conversation? This is a real challenge for publishers to see what's going on, but also to take part in those conversations. And then, do we buy the pivot to audio, or is it? Am I overhyping it here? Is it getting a bit out of control? It's clearly not going to save publishers, but what's its role in the whole wide range of media, from video to text or whatever? So some emerging questions and some thoughts, and we're really keen to hear your questions. Thank you.
Tracy's now going to tell us how you can ask a question. Tracy, over to you.
Thanks, John. And just a reminder that if you do have any questions for today, to please type those questions into the questions box. Thank you. John?
Okay, thanks, Tracy. So the questions box on your screen is where you type your question. I will then see it, and I will then read it out to Nick. So please go ahead and enter your questions as we go. I will see them. I've got a screen open here, and we'll see it the minute you enter the question. Some of you have already asked questions during the event and in advance of it, so I'll start off with some of those. But I just want to start, Nick, with so you began your presentation with some details on who's paying for news, and the answer is that it's not really showing an increase, people paying for online news. And we finished with audio. So on audio and podcasts, is anybody managing to make money out of that?
Yes, the New York Times is making millions of dollars, they tell us, out of podcasts. But again, we shouldn't use the New York Times as the only example. So I think the business models are emerging. So I think in one sense, it's a model that is fairly well understood. So in radio, if you get a lot of people listening for a long period of time, then sponsorship and advertising normally follows. And we're starting to see that in the US. So the advertising money or sponsorship money is sort of doubling year on year. But it's still a small percentage of the money that goes into radio, for example. Mm-hmm. So I think part of it is advertising kind of catching up, the famous Mary Meeker slide. Mm-hmm. If you get a lot of attention, currently the money isn't there, but if that attention continues, the money will come in. But I think what we're also seeing is the start of paid models. So platforms increasingly supporting the ability for subscription companies to include audio within it. So if you pay for a subscription, if you're in the car and you ask for a podcast, it will play, but only to subscribers. So that I think is coming. Spotify and others moving into the market and paying publishers specifically for exclusive content or early access content. I think that's going to be part of the picture as well. But it is not going to make publishers rich. No. The main thing, I think, is actually not the money that's going to come out of it. It's the loyalty. Mm-hmm. It's that sense that you are spending time with a publisher or with journalists who you like and have an affinity to. And I think that ultimately is going to be more important than the immediate dollars, because the real challenge for paid companies is going to be to avoid churn, to keep the subscribers they have. Mm-hmm. So having that additional connection, I think that's really ultimately where podcasts are going to play the biggest role.
So it fits into the sort of model of you're joining a club, you're becoming a member, you're in this group, we're all in this together, and there'll be a way to monetize that audience some other way, not necessarily directly through the podcast.
Yeah, I think so. I think digital is great at many things, but it has not proved to be able to deliver a lot of time for any individual publisher. And if you're not getting enough time, it's really hard to build that relationship. So I listen to the Guardian's daily podcast about 5 days a week. And since I started doing that, I have a much stronger sense of who the journalists are. I like not all of them, but I like some of them. And you feel that affinity. I think that's going to be critical.
Yeah, great. Okay, so through to some questions from some of our attendees. So there's a couple of questions about the future of print. So given the way social media has changed the news media, will there come a time when print will be completely obsolete? And somebody else from Bahrain asking, is this the end for print?
I don't think so. And people wrote print off a long time ago. And I think there's a chapter in the report where we look at young people in particular, and it's interesting, particularly those sort of millennials, Gen Y group, how they remember print, and they say that they still want these moments when they dedicated news moments. They're not during the week or during the day, but maybe at a weekend. They actually prefer to luxuriate with a magazine or with a weekend newspaper. And what was really interesting to me is that is true for young people as well. So I don't think print's going away. It will be much more a sort of luxury product, a time-based product that fits into the moment when people have time to really sort of relax or read longer articles.
I mean, there was an interesting slide I saw from the latest Mary Meeker report showing that the print share of the audience is smaller than the print share of advertising revenue. So in a sense, the revenue hasn't yet fallen as far as the audience.
But it's fallen a lot. I mean, since she first showed that slide, it's fallen a lot. Yeah. It would be interesting if she added the podcast one for next year, because that's currently not part of her slide.
Yeah. Okay, great. So one of the really concerning things in the report is the attention that the spotlight you're putting on news avoiders. That is a real threat to our industry. If people are actively running away from our product, turning it off as soon as news appears, that's really bad news for our industry and I guess for society as well. What's going on here?
Yeah, and I think there are two things going on there. So one is actually events. Many people don't like what's going on in their political situation or feel fearful about what's happening internationally. And we've all done it. Basically, I can't engage sufficiently with what's going on in Iran right now. It's just easier to find something entertaining on my mobile phone. So it's kind of got easier to avoid news. I mean, in the past, the news was on television, and if you switched over to the other channel, the news was on the other channel. If you switched over, it would be news again. It was harder to avoid news. And actually, you have to make an active choice in digital to go to a website, and many people don't have sufficient interest to do that, which is why services like Facebook are so useful, because they are surfacing and bringing news to people who are broadly avoiding the news. So from a democratic point of view, we talk a lot about the negatives of Facebook. That sort of incidental exposure in digital is harder, but Facebook at least is one place where it happens. And the other thing that's going on is, the stuff I talked about in terms of negativity and agenda. I think the news media has got a little bit out of sync with people's expectations, particularly young people's expectations around tone, around agenda. And I think that's really critical to listen to some of the data in this report about addressing those issues.
And one of the other things that we at Reuters are paying attention to is the demand for solutions-based journalism. People are looking for journalism to help them find answers to problems, not just outline what the problems are.
Right, and this is not the first time this kind of data has emerged, and there are now constructive journalism movements, solutions-based journalism movements, been going a long time in the US to try and address some of these problems that other people have picked up in research as well. And so I think more and more companies are launching units or programs that try and do this, or indeed building it into the daily news bulletins, as Danish DR has done, public broadcaster in Denmark, for for years and years, actually, and increase ratings in the process. And it's not about not telling the bad stories, but it's maybe about telling them in different ways. So crime figures, instead of necessarily always looking at the worst case, look at the most improved and say, what did they do? And so many companies are looking at that.
So one of the other things that caught my eye was your reference to a winner-takes-all world. We saw in the US, I think it was half the new subscription money goes to just 3 publishers. What's the message if you're not one of the big brands? I mean, the world is full, thousands and thousands of publishers. They can't all be number one in their market. What's the future?
So I should just caveat that by saying that I think what the internet does is it does tend to push a sort of biggest brand winner takes all in one sense. So I think in each country we're going to see 2 or 3 providers who are able to succeed with high quality news and subscription model. You will also have very small niche publications that work in the subscription world too. They find their audience, they provide valuable content. It can be one person, it can be a whole team of people producing subscription products. But they're clearly going to work in both areas. It's the stuff in the middle that's tricky, and I think if you're not one of those biggest brands, then you really have to look at diversified revenues, of which you can still monetize your most loyal users through certain type of subscription model, maybe like a metered model, and then on top of that, try and build community or events or a range of income streams. Advertising as well that help maintain a quality newsroom. So I think you need to be realistic about where you are and what mix of models is going to work. There is no one size fits all solution to this, and I think that's kind of where we've got to. Everyone sort of shifted to paid, but actually for many companies that will be right. For other ones it won't be right.
But sitting in the middle can be a tricky area because if you're not distinctive, you can get swamped by the big beasts.
Yeah, it is just massively competitive, isn't it? And you have to be clearer than ever about what you stand for. You have to stand out for something or for 2 or 3 things, and you have to really work to build that audience over time, to build that loyalty, build that habit. And I think, if there's one message that currently that is it. Publishers are increasingly recognizing that they're not going to survive with customers coming in for a minute and going away again. They have to build something of value.
Yeah. So what about, that sort of plays into a question about metrics. It used to be that we measured success by clicks. Increasingly, it feels to me we're moving towards time spent and loyalty as being more important to recognizing whether a brand is succeeding or not.
I think so. Obviously, reach and size is important as well. So particularly if you're working in the advertising market, but even if you're in the subscription market, it's a combination of sort of volume and loyalty. A lot of people are looking at frequency as a really key thing, because that just really is a proxy for loyalty. But absolutely, the metrics that we have been using for years are essentially built on advertising models. And even now, if you're in advertising, you have to think much more about loyalty and the quality of your audience. And you have to measure that, because ultimately, the big platforms are going to be much better at monetizing audiences, because they have better data and they have more people. So you have to really show, if you're in the advertising game now, that you know your audience, that you have a loyal audience, and that you're able to deliver that, and there's value to advertising in delivering that.
So here's a specific question that came in from, let me just see what part of the world. So this is about TV. So if you were, this is somebody saying, if we were running a TV news organization, how would you position yourself to compete with social and mobile? I think it's assuming that this TV news organization is not present on social and mobile.
Right. Yeah, it's very hard to answer that in the abstract. I think what we see in our data is that television news is becoming less important over time. So typically 2 to 3% fall in TV news in most countries we look at. That's both 24-hour news channels, but also appointment to view, which is being very strongly hit by Netflix and others. However, just like the question about print, I don't think TV is going away. It's an amazingly powerful medium. And in most countries we look at, it is pretty much equally important with online. So I think the first thing is how strong is your TV model, and the second thing is why do you want to move into online? What audiences are you chasing? What problem are you trying to solve? The one sort of positive I would say about digital and TV is the smartphone is sort of pushing towards more visual styles of communication. Just pushing 1,000-word articles into a mobile phone is probably not the most sensible thing to do. And we're seeing with the success of visual storytelling, things like Snapchat and Instagram, these very visual, really, really nice ways of telling stories on a smartphone. I think many of the skills that TV companies have could be quite well matched to that. So I would say think about the coming revolution, which is visual storytelling on a mobile, and see how you can capitalize on that.
I mean, in the UK and the US, we've seen the average age of the TV news viewer rising faster than the calendar moves. Right. There's no sign of that trend stopping.
No, I mean, as I said before, young people are not going to go back to TV.
And they will. You don't think they'll ever get to have it.
Well, some of them will watch it, but it's kind of incidental, and it will be at their convenience. And the notion of them sitting down at 10 o'clock or 8 o'clock and watching a TV news bulletin with the rest of the family, I mean, that's not how. Yeah. It doesn't mean to say they're not interested in issues or they're not interested in video. It's just that they're not. They don't want to consume news in that way generally.
So this idea that most people who do pay for news will only pay for one subscription, does that suggest that we'll need to find ways of collaborating? I mean, when you sign up to Netflix, you're signing up to all types of shows, from films to drama to documentary.
It's an aggregate, yeah.
It's an aggregator. Is there a future for news aggregation that people will pay for?
Apple thinks so. That's what Apple News Plus is basically about, and many other people have tried it. Glendale, there's just a whole load of small startups trying to do news aggregation. The tricky thing is that it is what the audiences want. They want frictionless access to the best of multiple brands, but it's not what the publishers want, because they fear what's happened before is essentially much of the value will be taken by the aggregator, not by the people producing content, and the sums don't add up. So this is really why you're having them trying to build their own individual single-sided subscriptions. And I think, ultimately we're going to see a mix of all these models. But at the time that the biggest brands are building up their single-title subscriptions, it's very hard to see them going into something like Apple Plus. This is why New York Times, Financial Times have not gone into Apple Plus, because they see the danger to what is currently a very successful and sustainable paid content model. And the aggregators need them most because people aren't going to, because they've got the best content. Yeah. So my own personal view is that there are lots of possibilities to bundle. For example, the Times bundles the Wall Street Journal in with the Times. So there's different ways in which you can provide extra value, and maybe the publishers should do more bundling or find ways of bundling with platforms on their terms rather than necessarily going in on these platform approaches.
One of the striking figures in the report was about trust in news, and this idea that only 49% of people who responded actually believe in the news they themselves use. That's extraordinary.
I think a lot of journalists would be surprised about that, but I mean, if you think about it from a personal point of view, quite often you're reading something you disagree with, you don't trust with, you don't trust, or you're reading something, you read a publication because of the sports news or the entertainment news, not for the political news. So, I think it's a bit more understandable when you put it that way. And actually, those figures haven't changed that much. They've gone down a few percentage points in the last 6 or 7 years, but I think to some extent it's always been true. We read things that we don't trust, but that we enjoy anyway.
And is there an element of it? Partly depends what platform it's delivered on. I mean, we see people tend to mistrust online information more than TV, for example, and news from social media has a lower score. I mean, we definitely see that television news brands are trusted more still. And I think a lot of that is seeing is believing. If you see the pictures, you think they can't be manipulated. How long that will go on for in the era of deepfakes, I don't know. But actually, a lot of it is just about the heritage of the brand. What you're really saying is, I trust
the BBC or ABC or these brands, CBS brands that have been around a long time, and they started in broadcast, and that sort of inherited sense that what they say must be true, I think continues. I mean, very unfairly, a lot of digital-born brands, people say they don't trust them as much, even though in many cases they do a fantastic job and produce great journalism.
I'm interested in the rise of WhatsApp as a news platform or a place where people find news. I mean, that's not something I'm familiar with in the UK. Could you just explain how it works and why you think it might be taking off?
It's just basically people are spending more time in these networks. So if you're spending time in WhatsApp and you're communicating with a whole range of people there rather than on Facebook, which is what used to be the case, then you will take news and discussions there naturally. And the way people are doing it quite often is just taking screen grabs from what's happening, something they see in Twitter or Facebook, and then they're taking the discussion into WhatsApp. So that's one way it's being used, say, in the US and UK. As I said, in countries like India and Brazil and South Africa, it's being used also as part of big groups. So there are groups set up to discuss a whole load of things. You are either signed up or you can sign up yourself. You can block those if you don't want to be part of it, and people need to have their phone numbers to sign you up. But in general, those large groups with people they don't know is much more prevalent in those countries. And additionally, you have people who buy phone numbers and then try and distribute news of various kinds to them, though WhatsApp are trying to clamp down on that as well.
So publishers will create their own groups.
They can create, there's a limit. So,
there's 250 or
250. So it's not a scalable thing. WhatsApp are trying don't want to encourage this. It's supposed to be a communication mechanism where people are in control. That's the whole value of it. And they don't want to change that and provide opportunities for brands to distribute content. So I don't see that changing soon. And that's positive, but there is a whole load of other issues around transparency and seeing how fake news is traveling, which are much harder within these networks.
Oh, exactly. It becomes invisible, doesn't it? Or very hard to track. The idea that phone numbers are valuable like that and people buy them in order to deliver news is maybe that's good news for the industry.
News matters.
Yes. So Nick, we've come to the end of the hour, so we will wind it up there. I'd just like to say thank you very much for your insights and for answering some of our questions. It's been extremely useful. I'll now hand over to Tracy, who will give you some information about where you can get more details of this year's digital news report. Tracy.
And thank you. Thanks, John. We'd just also like to thank everyone for the overwhelming number of fascinating questions today. We'll endeavor to follow up with as many responses to those questions that we were unable to fit into for today's session. Also, thanks so much for Nick and John for your presentation today. For more data and analysis on DNR 119, please visit digitalnewsreport.org. And for more news industry insights, visit reuterscommunity.com. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation, and we would appreciate it if you can complete that and provide your feedback. You will also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's session. And on behalf of Reuters News Agency and the Reuters Institute and our presenters, thanks for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.